Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson Booksellers is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're so very pleased you could join us here tonight, both in person and virtually, for the launch of Gaman, Perseverance, Japanese Canadians' Journey to Justice by Art Miki. This is, of course, Art's very long-awaited memoir, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have all of you here to celebrate it with us tonight. I won't take up too much of your time. I just have a few quick notes, and then I'll call up our guest of honor to share from the book. Now, we'd like to begin by thanking the good folks at Talonbooks for publishing this book in the first place, and of course to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for helping to spread the word around tonight. There'll be a reading from this podium. Following that, there'll be a conversation which will take place at the chairs to my left, and then there'll be an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So if you're located here in the audience, please just put your hand up and I'll run over to you with this microphone. That's not a comment on your ability to project your voice. It just ensures that those watching can hear your question and prevents us from having to repeat it. And if you are one of those people watching on YouTube, and I say looking deliberately at the camera, just write any questions you might have in the comments and in the chat, and we'll get to them as time permits. Now, Gaman, Perseverance describes the journey toward resolution for the historic injustice that deprived Japanese Canadians of their basic human rights after World War II. Miki details the intense negotiations that took place in the 1980s between the Government of Canada and the NAJC, negotiations which finally resulted in the historic Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement of September 1988 and the acknowledgment by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney that Canada had wronged its own citizens. Miki recollects his past experiences and family history, revealing the beliefs and attitudes that shaped his journey as a youth in British Columbia, an educator in Manitoba, and a community leader across Canada. We have a wonderful person here tonight to guide us through the conversation around this book. That, of course, is Terry MacLeod, an award-winning Emmy-nominated journalist, writer, and public speaker. He spent 30 years at CBC in Toronto and Winnipeg, where he hosted the most listened to radio shows in the region. Now, our very special guest this evening is, of course, Mr. Art Miki, an active leader in the Japanese Canadian community, having served as president of the National Association of Japanese Canadians from 1984 to 1992. He led the negotiations to achieve a just redress settlement, as I mentioned, for Japanese Canadians interned during the Second World War. Art is past president of the Japanese Cultural Association of Manitoba and the Asian Heritage Society of Manitoba. He is currently advisor to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Additionally, Art is a former teacher and principal, a Canadian citizenship judge, and a lecturer at the University of Winnipeg. Miki has received the Order of Canada, the Order of Manitoba, and the Order of the Rising Sun from the Government of Japan. Art is also a longtime customer, a friend of the store, and I've had the pleasure of working personally with him on Asian Heritage Society events in the past. So it's such a huge pleasure, both personally and professionally, to ask you to join me in welcoming Art Miki.
Yeah, what did you forget? Yes, please. Oh, I forgot my glasses. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming this evening, and certainly very pleased that Terry MacLeod could be the host. Just to give a little background, because I met Terry about 3 years ago now, and we were talking about this book. He read part of the manuscript, and he said to me, Art, he said, you know what, you should try to get published. And so I contacted Talonbooks in Vancouver, and they looked at the original manuscript and they said, fine, it looks okay. mind you, there's a lot of work to be done. So during COVID, I had a lot of time. And so I was able to bring out the old manuscript, which I started over 30 years ago, would you believe? A lot of the stuff on the redress, I wrote about 30 years ago, shortly after the agreement. And so that part was there, but the rest of it, I turned it from a redress book into a memoir because there were many things that came out of it. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I'm going to begin by reading part of the day of celebration. And that's the day when the government made the announcement. And there's a haiku that was written by Haruko Kobayakawa, who was on the Redress Committee in Vancouver. She was a very strong supporter of our organization, and she wrote this in celebration of that particular day. Reaching for justice. In time's persistence, unwavering at last, our redress resolution. For those people, a haiku is a Japanese poem, and because the message is so important, I thought that that would be part of the thing that I wanted to share with you. For every Japanese Canadian who had experienced the wartime trauma of the forced removal, internment, and deprival of their basic rights, September 22nd, 1988 was a day to remember. The dramatic statement by the Honorable Brian Mulroney in the House of Commons that a comprehensive redress agreement had been reached between the Government of Canada and the National Association of Japanese Canadians came as a pleasant surprise and shock. Some were lost for words to express their feelings. Others felt that the burden of guilt was lifted, or that the stain of the shame they felt from having been branded enemy alien was finally removed, while others just felt relieved that the struggle for redress is finally over. When Roger Obata listened to Mulroney's statement in the House, he said, "After almost 47 years, I felt for the first time that I was being officially recognized as being equal to any other Canadian. At last, I'm a first-class citizen, not a person suspected of disloyalty. Whatever emotions aroused in Japanese Canadians, the government decision to admit the wrong that had been committed was a historic precedent. It was certainly a day to celebrate." I'd like to share a part where the Prime Minister began his acknowledgement. And this is what he began to say. "Mr. Speaker, nearly a century ago, in the crisis of wartime, the Government of Canada wrongfully incarcerated, seized property, and disenfranchised thousands of citizens of Japanese ancestry. We cannot change the past, but we must, as a nation, have the courage to face up to these historical facts." Those words began the acknowledgement that we so dearly wanted to hear from the government. As the Prime Minister continued with his speech, tears began to flow, and it was difficult to contain my emotions as I struggled to listen to every word he said. It was hard for me to believe that we finally had achieved the goal that we had pursued for such a long time. I had dreamed that we would succeed, but to personally witness the accomplishment was absolutely exhilarating. A number of times in this speech, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney gestured to us in the gallery as he made reference to the National Association of Japanese Canadians. When he finished his address, the Prime Minister received a standing ovation from his colleagues in the House and from the visitors in the gallery. It was a moment to behold as people cheered, congratulated each other, hugged, kissed, and shed tears of joy. For those of us who have struggled through the Redress campaign, especially during the last 4 years, it was a dream come true. It was difficult for me to express in words the joy of triumph, except to say, I can't believe this has really happened. After the speeches in the House, immediately after the orations, a member of the Prime Minister's staff escorted me directly to the Prime Minister's office. Waiting alone to meet the Prime Minister, I wondered, how should I greet him? Should I address him as Mr. Prime Minister or Honorable Brian Mulroney? While I was thinking about what to say, the Prime Minister walked into the room and said, hello, Art, and came over and shook my hand. My quick response was, hello, Brian, nice to meet you. All of the formal protocol had vanished. I felt at ease with the Prime Minister as I thanked him for his passionate words. As we walked downstairs to the room in which the official signing of the agreement would be taking place, I said to him, it's taken a long time, but it was worthwhile waiting for. His reply was, well, it's taken this long for me to convince some of my colleagues that this was the right thing to do. I sensed sincerity and honesty in his response. My impression of Brian Mulroney was that he had a genuine interest in resolving the redress issue earlier, but that his party members did not share the same view. It was an unbelievable feeling when we entered the small crowded room of cameras and reporters for the signing of the official signing ceremony that was to symbolize the settlement. Members of our strategy committee, along with people like Lucien Bouchard and Jerry Weiner, stood behind the table at which the Prime Minister and I sat. There were 2 sets of the same documents to sign, one in English and then in French. The Prime Minister signed the first document and then handed it to me to sign. Meanwhile, all I could hear was the constant clicks from the cameras in the background. Once the documents were signed, we both stood. The Prime Minister then turned to me and said, may I just say to you and the leaders of the community who are here, some who are 86 and 87 years of age, who went through that personally, I say this is a moment of long coming, of tolerance and for justice for your community and for Canada. I want to do this to you and for all the people who believed in the basic fairness of Canada. Mr. Mulroney began to clap. Everyone joined in. I replied, I must say, Mr. Prime Minister, we were very moved this morning by your comments that were made in the House. I know that today is a historic landmark, not only for our community, but for the human rights issue. Indeed, for me, the importance of the redress settlement was not only what it did for Japanese Canadians, but what it did for the recognition of minority rights in Canada.
You're good to go.
Well, Art, thanks for creating such a marvelous book. It is a complicated, moving read with incredible detail. But I want to start by asking, why did you title the book the way that you did? You called it Gaman, Perseverance. What's that mean?
Well, Gaman in Japanese means perseverance. It means that you don't give up. You continue to go despite the difficulties that are in front of you. And I felt that through our journey, through the human rights, even in Canada, it's perseverance that's so important. And so I thought that the title was appropriate for the situation that I was just trying to describe, especially when we're dealing with human rights issues.
And considering the adversity along the way from the very beginning, I guess it's appropriate that your middle name is Kazumi, which means harmony, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because you managed to find harmony in some very difficult circumstances. Where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in 1936 in Vancouver. And both my parents were also born in Canada as well. So our family's been in the country for a long time. It was my grandparents who came to Canada from Japan in the 1890s and 1903.
And you were born in the year of the rat, right?
That's right, the rat.
What's that mean?
It means that you persevere. It means that you work hard and you try to attain your goal. And the interesting part is I married, my wife is actually a horse, I think, is it? And in the documents, when you read that, it suggests that a rat should never, ever marry a horse. And so that's where perseverance comes in again.
And so you were forced to move from, what was it called? Haney,
BC.
Haney,
Yes.
BC, which then became Maple Ridge,
Yes.
part of suburban Vancouver.
Right.
And when you were 5 years old.
Yes.
And that was because of the War Measures Act at the time?
Yes. At that point, in 1941, Canada declared war in Japan. And shortly after, the government of Canada, in determining the possible threat that they felt Japanese may pose, imposed the War Measures Act and passed orders in council that restricted the civil rights of Japanese Canadians.
And those restrictions were pretty severe, as you
Well,
tell us.
it meant removal from the west coast of Canada. Properties were confiscated, possessions confiscated. There was a curfew imposed upon Japanese that you couldn't go out at night. And so there were a lot of restrictions that were imposed, and the government's policy was then to remove people. So they moved them into a place called Hastings Park, which is in Vancouver. People who lived on the island were directed to Hastings Park. In our case, because we were in the Fraser Valley, which is further east, and at that point in time, the BC government or BC sugar beet growers were shortage of laborers.
And here in Manitoba, they were.
Yeah, Manitoba, yeah.
Yeah.
And so they sent a recruitment team to Haney in that area to recruit farmers to go out to Manitoba. So the second trainload of people who came here were mostly all people from that area.
And in what way were your parents affected by the War Measures Act and this forced removal?
Well, I think, it meant that anyone who had a job certainly lost it because you're being forced out of your home, especially with, I think it was more difficult for my grandparents who owned a berry farm in Haney, 7-acre berry farm, which they eventually lost. In fact, what was happened was that a Caucasian minister happened to be from the United Church, was visiting and staying at my grandpa's place, and he said to him, you're not going to come back. It's going to take 4 or 5 years. And he advised them that maybe they should try to sell their property if they could. And he did. And many of the people in that community sold their property, but certainly at a very low price. There were speculators who were there to pick it up. But
so how did your family get to Manitoba?
Well, they came by train. My mother said that each person was given $2. The train took 2 days and 3 nights to come to Manitoba. And they were just in a coach type of situation. So there's no lounging around. It was just crowded conditions. And And people said it was a very difficult journey.
And you ended up working or living close to the Lemoyne family in St. Agathe, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was a Lemoyne family that actually came down to the immigration center where the Japanese Canadians were being
And the
housed.
immigration center was beside Union Station.
Yeah, Union Star. It was the Royal Alexander, the other CPR station.
Oh, the other one. Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, every day the farmers would come with their truck and they would look at the group of people who were available to work, and certainly there were many adults who were picked first. Families that had small children and very few adults remained at the center for a long time because no one wanted them.
But your mother was pregnant at the time, wasn't she?
That's right, yes.
And so what happened to her, with her?
Well, with her pregnancy, while she was pregnant, certainly she couldn't work out in the sugar beet field, but she did all the cooking, I think, for the people. And then in order to have her baby, she had to get special permission. So she had to write a letter to the RCMP, who in turn contacted BC Securities Commission to give permission that she could go into Winnipeg. Because at that time, Japanese could not move freely in Manitoba. If you went beyond 10 miles, you have to have special permission. You were supposed to stay on the farm. So in her case too, she had to go by herself into Winnipeg by bus and have her baby and then come back.
What reception did your family get from the folks in St. Agathe?
Well, I think the French Canadians there were very curious about who we were, but they were friendly. And in fact, many years later, we still had some contact with a few of them. And so my brother and I went back to St. Agathe, this is about 15, 20 years ago, and met some of the people who helped us. And it was great. They still remembered us.
But the reception in other parts of the province weren't as welcoming. The reception wasn't as welcoming as it was in St. Agathe.
True.
Now tell us about the St. Andrews Council, or about the mayor and council in St. Boniface, what they did and said.
Well, in St. Boniface, the packing houses wanted to hire Japanese. And the city council there in St. Boniface refused or would not allow Japanese to be hired as workers, mainly because they don't want Japanese people there. In the case of St. Andrews, there was quite an effort made to get rid of the Japanese. There were policies that the local council passed to remove Japanese from the area. And mainly because there were many of the Hong Kong vets who lived in the area, and there was this concern that there'd be violence directed towards people and that type of thing. And in fact, the Japanese who were in that area said that cars would come and park in front of their place and watch them and look at them because they wanted to see a Jap. That's essentially what happened. And so those people would ask the BC Security Commission to remove them from that particular area, which they did.
But looking now, though, at the circumstances, say in Hong Kong, which were horrendous for Commonwealth soldiers,
Right.
What did you learn after that? There were terrible, terrible things that happened in Hong Kong to those soldiers.
Right, that's certainly true. And there are a lot of stories with regard to, the kind of treatment. I think the difficulty was that people didn't differentiate between Japanese Canadians and Japanese. And because we were of Japanese background, we were considered as if we were part of Japan and that we were to blame for what was happening to them. And so many of the veterans groups would not endorse redress at all. In fact, there were resolutions passed at their meetings not to give redress to Japanese Canadians. Although when we met privately with some of the leaders, they indicated that they themselves would not direct the organization to speak publicly to say they opposed it. They left it up to the individuals because they felt that they saw the issue as being two different things, but not everyone did, and that's a difficulty.
but the Mennonites in North Kildonan treated you differently.
Yes, in fact, it was the Mennonite Central Committee was the first group of people who came to us and said, we want to apologize for what happened to Japanese Canadians who were interned in the West Coast. And part of that is because they did some research and found that there were a number of Mennonites who bought property in the Fraser Valley that belonged to Japanese. And they felt guilty about that. And so they came to us and said, we'd like to make a formal apology. And then they also wanted to do something to honor that. So we set up a scholarship called the Mennonite Japanese Scholarship, given to anyone who wanted to research or do work on human rights. And so that was their contribution, which was, quite amazing because in essence, they were the first group officially to come forward to do that.
Now, by 1948, elderly Japanese Canadians were allowed to live in Manitoba, right? Did the policy change?
Well, I know initially when the Japanese were brought here, it was with the understanding that at the end of the war, they would have to leave. But by that time, they had settled in so much that there was no way that you could just remove them. Many of the people were on the farms, after a few years moved into the city and established themselves. Interesting enough, many of them got jobs that belonged to companies that were run by Mennonites or the Jewish community. So they were the ones who took in many of the workers. But by that time, people were too established. It would have been very difficult to remove them. Where would you send them anyways?
I was going to ask you, in what part of the city did your family eventually settle?
Well, initially it was in the core area around Logan Avenue, Alexander, in that area. And that was the central part of the city where a lot of immigrants lived in that area too. So many of the friends that I had were either from immigrant families or Métis or Indigenous people. And today it's recognized as likely the poor part of the city. So, but that's where many of the Japanese, that's all they could afford because they lost everything during the removal. And so they had no money. And I know in my family too, both my mother and father had to work long hours. I think my mother never worked before, but she was thrust into that situation. So for them, it was a very difficult time of their life.
But I understand that your mother was a significant influence in your life in a number of different ways. Role model, and she was a big advocate for redress. How did you hear that from her?
Well, yeah, she was an interesting person. Many of we call it Nisei or second generation, and many of the women were subservient to their husband.
Nisei
is first generation.
Nisei,
born in Japan.
Okay, and then the Nisei?
They're born in Canada, but their parents were from Japan. And
so you weren't a Nisei, you were?
I'm a Sansei.
Sansei, which generation is that?
That would be the third generation.
And then this is the generation after the Sensei is?
Yonsei.
Yonsei, yeah. And that's the fourth?
Fourth.
And are there and what's the fifth generation?
Gosei.
Gosei. And so are there people in this room who identify with those definitions? Yes?
Well, the Japanese would.
Okay. And so Gosei, right? That's the fifth generation?
Yeah.
And so there's a little girl in the front. Is she a Gosei? Gosei. Oh, okay. Wow. Hey, thanks for that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about your career in education. You were eager for all kinds of education. What did you study and where did you study?
Well, I went to teachers college and became a teacher that way. I had gone to university for a year, but by chance, I met a friend of mine who was going to the college, and I accidentally, well, not accidentally, but I went with them as he was going to enroll. And while I was sitting in the principal's office listening to what they were going to offer, I decided to sign up as well. So I changed careers just like that.
To go to,
Best move I made.
and that was the Teachers College.
Yeah, Teachers College.
Yeah. And so how many degrees do you have?
3 actually.
So University of Winnipeg.
Yes, and Bachelor of Science and then Bachelor of Education from U of M.
Yes.
And I have a Master's of Education from U of M.
Okay. And so, and now what got you involved initially in the redress movement? What was it that attracted you to it?
Well, first of all, I was quite active in the local community. And so, I was part of the organization there. And when we began to talk, it was in 1977, we had the celebration, it was called the Centennial Year, 100 years of Japanese in Canada. And at that point, there were a number of activities that took place, and we formed a national body to organize national activities. And so I got involved with that, and from there, I became part of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, the political arm, and they're the ones who pursued redress. So I sort of rolled into that.
So very early on, like the millennials say these days, I'm an influencer. You became an influencer, right?
Well, my wife doesn't think so.
You're a bad boy. So let's talk a little bit about your movement into the area of redress, but also how you were helped to shape the values of the students who studied with you. There's a young woman, I think she's sitting in the back, who was a student of yours. And you were very much engaged in a lot of different ways of educating students in unconventional ways. What were the things that you were really focused on?
Well, I'll tell you, when I went to school at junior high at Hugh John Macdonald, and for those, that's in the core area of Winnipeg, it reminded me of a prison, first of all, because when you move from one class to another, you have to walk in a certain row in the hallway on one side or the other. And even if the room was right adjacent to you on the main floor, you may have to have walked right across the top floor back to that room because everyone moved in one direction. That's the kind of thing that I lived with. And I said to myself, you know what? If I ever became a teacher or a principal, I would change that. It would, and so and this happened when I went back to university and got my science degree, and then I went out to Transcona Springfield. And it was interesting how things happened by chance, because I had left Winnipeg School Division on leave of absence. And the year I was going to go back to Winnipeg, I went to see the superintendent and said, you know, I wanted to check and see where I'd be placed on my way back. And somehow they forgot or lost my application or for the change. And they said, well, don't worry, we'll find you a place. But on the same day, I looked in the paper, there's a job in Transcona. I called them and the superintendent said, can you come down right away? I'll wait for you. And I got there at 6 o'clock and signed the contract. So I moved into Transcona, which was a growing community at the time. And for me, that was the best move that happened.
Why?
Because shortly after I became principal and moved very quickly. And so the first school I went to was a brand new school being built. It was called Harold Hatcher. And I had proposed a program there that we would try to establish like a non-graded school, family orientation, so on. It was quite different.
Did that work?
Well, it worked. That's a school that I still have the most people come to me and say how much they enjoyed it. But, you know, it was interesting. But we were able to, the superintendent I had was just excellent, allowed these things to occur. And I was given the latitude, and there are a couple of teachers here who are part of that group. I was given the latitude to hire staff for that particular school because of the philosophy, which was a little different. And so we had a great time. It was a great staff. I still enjoyed that very much. And then I moved on to another brand new school called Joseph Terrace, and we were able to carry on some different programs there as well. So it was, for me, being a principal allowed me the opportunity to try different things that normally you wouldn't do.
Now, you were very accomplished in education and as an educator, but your engagement with politicians was key to making the redress movement move ahead. What was it like dealing with all those politicians all the time? Like this, the stream of politicians that you worked with here and across the country.
Right. The first thing I learned after meeting with them a lot is that they don't know that much. You know, we'd sit down and discuss issues, and I began to wonder, what do they really know about some of these things? And so that really, after Redress was over, it really influenced me to maybe go into politics.
Well, I know you gave it a try, right?
Yes, I did.
In Transcona, wasn't it?
In Transcona,
yeah. And it almost worked for you, right?
It was very, very close, yes.
You got a lot of support from some very prominent Liberal politicians. Tell me who those people were. Lloyd Axworthy among them, right?
Well, he was one. Well, mind you, he was my MP, so he had to support me. But yeah, Lloyd Axworthy, Terry MacLeod, a number of people who have now passed away. Some politicians trying to think of their names, but they all came out. Sharon Carstens came out a number of times to campaign with me, which was great. So yes, I had a lot of support. John Cretchen came out twice to the riding that I was in.
But you were running against Bill Blakey.
That's right.
Incumbent, right?
Yes.
And that was tough.
It was.
Yeah. And it didn't quite work out for you.
No, I think we lost by 200 votes. But the amazing part of this whole thing is on the day of the election, it was so close, and we didn't know for sure one way or another. Henry was part of the campaign team, so he remembers this. But it was so close. At about 4 in the morning, I got a phone call from the campaign, someone from the campaign office in Transcona said, by the way, he says, you won. You were elected. And I said, oh. Anyways, the next day I get up in the Globe and Mail, they had me winning. Later on in the day, I get a phone call saying, we made a mistake. Someone had left some of the tally sheets in the box, and so they couldn't tally it all. And in order to get the box open, they had to get permission from Ottawa, which took another few days. And then they had to do the count. And so, well, 4 days later, they told me I didn't win.
Now, that was in the latter part of your career, but I want to talk a little bit about your television and radio career. Well, getting the ideas out. You and Barbara Frum on the National Cross-Country Checkup, Front Page Challenge, all those big shows, and you were a star.
Well, I wouldn't say that. But it was a way to promote what we were involved in. Even on Front Page Challenge, that was one of the headlines. Japanese Canadians want redress. And Pierre Burton finally got that. But the thing was that it allowed us to talk about it, because at that time, there were very few people who knew about the redress. They didn't even know what happened to Japanese Canadians. I recall traveling on the airplane a number of times, and people would say, what are you involved in? I would explain that I was involved in this redress where Japanese Canadians were interned, and they'll say, you in Canada? This happened in Canada? A lot of people just did not know.
So what was your proposal for the amount of redress that you felt was required?
Well, I guess there are two ways to look at it. We knew, first of all, in the United States, similar treatment of Japanese Americans, except they were sent to concentration camps. in the United States, they were allowed to go back much earlier than in Canada, and also they couldn't confiscate property. Whereas in Canada, they took the property. So there were differences.
But individual Japanese Americans got what, $20,000?
20,000, and that was a proposal that was put forward back in 1983. And so we picked up on it, saying, well, the treatment in Canada was worse. So we came up with approximately that figure as well. And we also did a survey of our community across the country, the people who were victims, and the amount that they were suggesting would be in that range. And so we used that in our proposal.
And what was the total amount of the redress when it was all time? How many, 100 and how many thousand Japanese Canadians received?
Well, there were 22,000 who were removed, 18,000 received payment in the end. And it cost about $443 million.
And that was for $21,000 a person.
Per person, yeah.
Now, when did you begin to look outside the Japanese Canadian community and say, we weren't the only people who suffered injustice, there were others, and you became very active in the Indigenous community?
Yes, in fact, it's interesting because with the Indigenous group too, when we were in Toronto, I had a request to meet with some chiefs from Stony Plain tribe in Ontario. And it was an interesting story because their reserve was confiscated under the War Measures Act to build military huts.
Just as your family's land.
Right, and they were removed. And so they came to us and told us this story, and they said, is there any way you can help us? And we actually offered to develop a paper for them in terms of a proposal, which we sent in to the government on their behalf. And so we had, but that issue lingered for a long time. And for those people who may not know, Dudley George was killed by the Ontario police. That was one of the issues. But several years later, that issue finally got resolved. They got their land back as well as compensation. But it took a long time, but we were very supportive of them. And also with the Assembly of First Nations, one day I met Ovid McCurdy on the plane. He had just become Grand Chief. And I was sitting right
You met him on the plane?
Yeah, on the plane behind him. And he turned to me, he says, well, he knew who I was. And we started talking. And so then I engaged him to come and speak to our national body as well. And then later on, he called me and asked whether I could work with their committee on redress for the residential school. So I did go out and met with a group in Edmonton and met with the group. But at that point, the Indigenous community was at a stage where there was a lot of negative reaction towards the Assembly of First Nations for even considering this. In fact, one of the women the committee that I was meeting with said she was getting threats on her life because she was involved in a way attacking the church and so on. And many of the elders did not want that. So they went through a long process. And it was later on when Phil Fontaine became Grand Chief, he invited me to go to Calgary.
Well, doesn't he write the forward to your book?
Yeah, he did actually. But I got involved with them, and I met with their community several times over. And basically what they wanted to hear was our story, because what the government was offering the Assembly of First Nations and also the residential school was only those people who were sexually or physically abused would be eligible, no one else would. And they liked our position where everyone in our community whose basic rights were deprived were eligible. And so they adopted that position, and they were going to take the government to court. And by that time, the government began to change. And so the Assembly of First Nations settlement is quite similar to the one that we have.
And you met a fellow who is the father of our current premier in Manitoba.
Oh, well, that was, I was at the Truth and Reconciliation, the first meeting that was held
for that, and that was held in Winnipeg, and I was speaking there, and one of the people was Wabkanu's father, who was at that point an elder who was working with the University of Winnipeg on Indigenous studies. So I met him there, and his son is now the premier.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Mr. Canoe has passed away.
Oh, hasn't. Yeah. And then you began to reach out beyond the communities that we just talked about to focus on the Chinese head tax redress movement and Ukrainian Canadians who were persecuted during World War I.
Right, yes. Well, in a lot of ways, they came to us for advice and help, and whenever there were conferences where we could promote or assist them, we did. And so I did work closely with the Ukrainian community as well as the Chinese community. And I remember I marched on Parliament Hill with the Chinese Canadian group. And for those people who know a little history, Japanese and Chinese did not always get together, see eye to eye, at least overseas. But anyways, when I marched with this one veteran, Chinese Canadian, he said to me, you know what, I'm so glad you're here, because it was important for them to show that we were all part of the same and not that we were at war with each other here, you know.
You did work in other countries though as well, looking at the impact on the Japanese residents of Chile, of
Right.
well, Peru.
Peru is a horror story.
Well, eventually a Japanese fellow became the president of Peru.
Right, yeah, Fujimori.
Not a very pleasant fellow.
Well, I met his wife, she was very pleasant. The day that we were in Peru, we went to his palace and he wasn't there, but his sister was looking after the palace. And it was because of a conference that we had, but the Peru story is so interesting because the American government actually went into Peru and kidnapped many Japanese Peruvians. People who were maybe sitting in a bar were rounded up by the soldiers, and they were taken by boat to Texas. And the reason they were taken there, they were being held as hostages in exchange for prisoner of war from Japan. Yeah, there were something like 800 people who were held hostages, and I think about 300 or 400 were actually sent to Japan in exchange for American soldiers who were captured there.
Now, you know, your book is only 380 pages long, and we could keep talking. But I want to mention as well, I mean, and John Tays mentioned many of the awards and recognition and achievements that you've made and had in your life. And I know that people still stop you on the street from when you were a citizenship judge, Mr. Miki. Hi, Mr. Miki. Hello, Judge.
Yeah.
But of all the honors that you've received, of which are you most proud?
Well, it's hard to differentiate. I guess the Order of Canada was the one that the first time, and for me, that was quite an experience. I had a chance to meet with Leonard Cohen and have supper with him. And it was interesting because he was getting the Order of Canada at the same time. And after the ceremony, I was sitting there and Leonard Cohen came up and said, "Can I sit with you?" And so we started talking and he was telling me, he said, you know, he said, "I was watching you," he said, "I really loved the way you bowed." Did I bow? But he said, "I really loved the way you bowed." And so and then he told me a little bit about his involvement with Zen and how he used to go into the hills of California to a monastery. And every year he would spend about a month there where he doesn't speak at all. He just meditates and so on. So he's telling me this. And then my wife and I, Keiko, we went to a concert for Leonard Cohen in Winnipeg. And
I was there.
Halfway through the concert, he introduced his musician. And for each one, he looked at them, he bowed to them and said very nice things about them. And I kept looking at them and thinking, gee, that's really amazing because the way he bowed.
Now, speaking of music, as a final question, I understand you're involved with hip hop these days.
Well, not really. Andrea's here. They invited me to help them for organize a group of hip hop people. K-pop.
Oh, it's K-pop, like
K-pop,
Korean pop.
We're actually in the process of forming a K-pop association in Manitoba. It's for youth group. It's a youth group for youth and by youth. And Art is one of the youth members.
Of course he is. Now, I wanted,
But I can't do it. I can't.
you can't perform K-pop?
No.
One thing I found pretty surprising was that I spoke with the Korean elders about K-pop and I couldn't really talk to them about it, but with the art, I was able to. He's nearly 90 and I don't see him as a 90-year-old. I actually see.
Yeah, okay, so just so we can have this, so that everybody else can hear it. So tell us a bit about your involvement in K-pop and what art has to do with it.
Oh, well, actually, I'm Korean descent, but my grandma was Japanese, so I'm quarter Japanese. I met Art and I told him about K-pop, that and I told him that I want to help Korean Canadian youth form a group because there are lots of K-pop cover dance groups in Winnipeg, but they don't have any like collective voice. So I met with them this year and we decided to form groups. There are two groups that we're forming right now. One is called the Manitoba Korean Canadian Youth Network, and the other one is called K-pop Association Manitoba. But when I talked to the Korean community, I couldn't really get any support. But however, when I talked to Art, he understood exactly what I was talking about. So although he's close to be 90, I don't see him 90. I actually see him as youth almost, like he's really young at heart. He's probably one of the only people that I could talk about K-pop and who understood. He's very supportive of youth, I found, and also he just mentioned about China and Japan. Historically don't get along overseas, and there's definitely some sad history between Korea and Japan. However, him helping Korean youth, that means really a lot to us because there are right now at least 9 K-pop cover dance groups in Winnipeg. And last time we had a meeting over Zoom and he was there. So we're very impressed. He actually came to the meeting and talked to youth about our incorporation right now. So yeah, it's somebody that I could talk to K-pop about K-pop. It's just amazing.
Oh man, so are there any other questions? We need to conclude a bit, but I know that there's a lot to react to and a lot to think about. And John has the microphone here, and I know who you are, and you know who Art is. I mean, we just met tonight, but tell us your connection to Art and why you're here.
Okay, so I moved here from England when I was in grade 2, and we were the first group of kids that were in the brand new school, Joseph Terrace, and Mr. Miki was our principal at the time. And it was a magical time. I mean, that school was magical. Anyways, my question to you is this. You were the only administrator that I had in my 12 years of education, 12 years of education, that was of color. And I've been an educator in the division now for like 18 years, I believe. And I have not worked for an administrator of color. And so there are some barriers that even still that we are facing as educators who are of color. And my question is, what advice do you give people like me who are trying to evoke some change into our system, but it's a very colonized system still, and we are fighting what seems like an uphill battle all the time. And we take a few steps forward, but obviously it's just taking a long time.
Well, I guess the word persistence is still always important. In front of you are two educators who are both administrators, by the way. Fortunately,
Seven Oaks is the best.
yeah. So
Seven Oaks is the best.
they're the people you should be talking to. They're right there in front of you. But it's true. At the time that I was principal, there were very few people of color who were in that position. Although Henry used to be a school superintendent, which was another person who certainly broke the barrier when it came to that kind of position. But it really is work. It's continuing. You do your best to apply for these positions. And I think in time people recognize your abilities, and I think you can get ahead. So,
Another question? John has the mic. No. Well, we're at 7:58, so our time is largely used up. But if you have a last minute question, please feel free to ask it. Art, yeah. Art, by the way, is going to be signing books at the back of the room at the desk by the checkout there.
First, I want to thank you for all the work that you've done in our community, for our community, to change our community. I'm wondering, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?
I think I'll join a K-pop group. Gotta do something to keep moving. But no, I'm always busy, and I'm still involved with a number of projects. So, and that's the thing that keeps, I think, myself active, and certainly it's good to be always working on something, So, and also fitness is important. I still go to the gym as much as I can, which is important. And that was one thing that came out of the election when I ran. After campaigning for about 9 months, I lost a lot of weight, which is great. But then in order to maintain that, I decided right after that I would join the Refit. And so I've been a member of Refit for over 30 years as a result, still continuing. So.
And you still play River Heights Old Timers hockey?
No, I retired when I was 65.
Okay.
The young people are getting too fast.
Anything else? Yes.
Just a quick question, Art. Like you mentioned, a lot of Japanese that were moved to Manitoba for sugar beet and other issues. A number of years ago, I was at the museum in New Denver. What was different about that versus people that were moved onto the prairies?
Well, when people were being removed, there were a couple of options that could happen to a person. One was being sent to an internment camp, and these internment camps were all located in the interior of BC. New Denver, Slocan, Caslo, all of those were internment centers. There were other people like our family where they needed sugar beet workers, not only in Manitoba, but Alberta as well. And so some 5,000 Japanese were sent to sugar beet farms in the West. And there was another group of people who were put into prisoner of war camps. They were the people who were considered leaders in the family who had potential influence because of threat of security, etc. And so about 800 people ended up in Northern Ontario in the prisoner of war camps that were used for the Nazi prisoners as well. And so people were placed in there. So those are the different situations that could arise. The New Denver Memorial is actually They've used some of the old buildings that people are housed in as part of the museum. And I was there for the official opening, which is quite unfortunately, it's not located on the main highway. It's very difficult to get to. But they still have the museum there and it's still functioning.
There's a photo of you and Mulroney there too.
Oh,
Yes, let's get the mic to.
Oh, and actually, we're just at the top of the hour, so
Yeah.
if it is, if you folks are ready with any closing comments you might have, any other questions can be directed to Art right when we get to the signing table, and I'll have details about signing at the close of the event. So do you two have any closing comments at all?
I don't accept. It's been a huge pleasure to hang out with you and to dive deep into this book and analyze it. There's so much more we didn't get to talk about. Thank you very much.
oh, you're welcome. Well, for myself, I'm finally glad it's over because I started this book well over 30 years ago. It's taken that long. It's gone through a lot of revisions and time, but I'm so glad it's finally done. So thank you for coming out this evening. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much for joining us here tonight and for your attention and for your questions. So we will be moving along to the signing portion of this evening now. So we'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we safely transport Art to the table that Terry mentioned, which is just beside our cash desk. I'll let you know when you can wander over and get books signed. We have books at the table, we have books at the cash desk. Please feel free to get a copy of the book signed before you pay for it. Just please do pay for the book. We're so enormously grateful to, of course, Talonbooks for publishing this beautiful book. Talon does such incredible work. We're always thrilled when we're able to partner with them, to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And I'm going to ask you to join me in 2 rounds of applause. The first is for, of course, our host for the evening, Terry MacLeod.
John, could I just make one brief comment?
Oh, of course, Art.
I'd like to just mention that the cover has a crest with 3 trees, and that's actually a family crest. The word Mickey, it means 3 trees, and Jesse, who's here, my grandson actually redesigned it, and so we've been using that as a symbol of our family crest.
It is a beautiful book. It's also fully embossed as well, so you can actually feel the texture of the trees on the front of the book. And so now I will ask you to join me in an uproarious round of applause for the one and only Art Miki.